I'm Connor Reid with words to that effect.
And the metaphor used by both was, believe it or not, zombie.
The recent resurgence of zombies.
Pride and Prejudice and zombies.
This zombie book.
The zombie survival guide.
Zombie frappuccinos.
Because of technology.
We're getting reports from all over the country that the recent indices are rising up.
Whether we like it or not, the zombies are coming for us all. Films, books, computer games, comics and TV shows. Historical and mythical zombies. Claims to have proven the scientific truth behind zombification. They're the gruesome, cannibalistic monsters of horror and the harmless creatures of children's playground games. They're zombie flash mobs and zombie parades, zombie cocktails and drinks. There's zombie capitalism and zombie corporations. And of course, the zombie apocalypse. They're coming. Shuffling, inexorably, unthinkingly, to consume us all, to infect us. And there's nothing, it seems, that we can do to stop it. We've all seen a zombie film or TV show. The Walking Dead is one of the most successful TV shows of all time. Or maybe you've just dressed up as a zombie for a Halloween party. You know what a zombie is. Or maybe you don't. Take the following list, for example. Which of these would you consider to be a zombie? A noisy child, a three-legged horse, a wretched dog too weak to bark, a female spirit with a broken neck, the soul of a person caught in a bottle, a person with catatonic schizophrenia expelled from their community, a bewitched slave, a coughing spectre that spreads tuberculosis, an entranced person easily returned to life by eating salt, a figure in the voodoo pantheon of gods. The answer, as you may now be suspecting, is all of the above. The zombie, it turns out, is very difficult to pin down. This list is from Zombies, A Cultural History by Roger Luckhurst. Professor Luckhurst is the Professor in Modern and Contemporary Literature at Birkbeck, University of London. As he makes very clear in his book, the story of zombies is long and complicated, and is wrapped up in a history of violence and subjugation, of slavery and mass slaughter. It is most certainly not a story which begins in the 1960s with George Romero and Night of the Living Dead.
Okay, well, I mean, most people think about the zombie as a very modern addition to the Gothic monster, and they kind of know that there's Night of the Living Dead, which is 1968, the George Romero film, and they might know that there's a 1932 film called White Zombie, and then after that it gets a bit vague.
To really understand the zombie, you need to go right back to the 19th century. There are 4 key stages in the zombie story, each around 50 years apart. There's the modern obsession with zombies today, beginning in and around the early 2000s and continuing up until now. Go back 50 years or so from today, there's Night of the Living Dead and the other Romero zombie films in the 60s and 70s. If you jump back another 50 years to the 1920s and 30s, there's the explosion of interest in zombies in the pulp magazines in the US. And then back 50 years once more, there are the early encounters of Western writers in the 1880s. The zombie is a creature of the margins. It straddles the world of the living and the dead. But it also comes from the margins of empire. The vampire, the zombie's only real cultural rival, emerged from the edges of Europe in the 19th century, where the territories of the great European powers ended and the Ottoman Empire began. The Mummy, incredibly popular in the late 19th and early 20th century, haunted British popular fiction at a time when the British occupied Egypt on the boundaries of a rapidly expanding empire. And in just the same way, the zombie arrived in American popular culture from the margins of a new American empire, from the Caribbean and particularly from Haiti. At the time, the US was rapidly expanding its overseas territories: Cuba, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, and from 1915 to 1934, Haiti. It's this Caribbean history, so inescapably linked with slavery and plantations, that provides the origins of the zombie. And it's a bloody, horrific past that the zombie character has never fully lost. One of the earliest mentions of the zombie in an English language work is by an Irish-Greek writer. He's a really fascinating character in his own right, a man called Lafcadio Hearn.
Who went to the French colony of Martinique And he kept hearing this word zombie with no E on the end. So this phrase zombie, which was part of the patois or Creole in Martinique. And he kept asking people, what is a zombie? And he kept getting hilariously different answers. So everyone he asked, he got a completely different response. His maid would say to him, "Oh, well, obviously it's a ghost," and somebody else would say, "Well, that's a zombie is a three-legged horse," or a zombie is one of those spirits that you meet on the road at night, or oh, they're kind of dead people who also happen to labour in bakeries, in the back room of bakeries. So he just got increasingly bewildered by this sense of kind of superstition around this object, and he could never quite pin it down.
And then there's William Seabrook, writer, journalist, explorer, occultist, sadomasochist, cannibal. He was an American journalist who made his name mixing with the modernist crowd in Europe and exploring exotic locations and topics like witchcraft and the occult. He wrote about his experiences living with a tribe in West Africa who practiced ritual cannibalism, although much to his disappointment he wasn't allowed to eat any human flesh, so he returned to Paris and purchased some from a morgue and ate it in order to say he was now a cannibal. Most importantly for the story here, however, is his 1929 book The Magic Island, exploring the voodoo practices of Haiti. He
was researching kind of superstitions in Haiti, and someone mentioned the word zombie, and they said, "Well, if you want to meet one, we'll just take you down the road. There are 3 down the road right now." And his famous description of dead men working in cane fields is precisely the origin of the modern zombie, because within 3 years, it's in the film White Zombie in Hollywood. They refer directly to William Seabrook's work, and then it absolutely takes off.
Although there was another very different reason the zombie exploded in popularity at this time.
A major cocktail was named The Zombie in the early 1930s, and everyone got blind drunk on that for about 10 years. So that's what really kicked it off in America, and the kind of rest is history.
William Seabrook's dead men working in cane fields were, of course, not dead, but simply men working in appalling conditions for American sugar companies, in what many Haitians would have seen as a return to the slavery of the very recent past. Zombies and slavery are very closely intertwined.
They're absolutely horrendous conditions in French, particularly French, but also English slave colonies. So they would transport slaves, the famous Middle Passage, from Africa, West Africa, over to the Caribbean to work sugarcane, which was a hugely profitable industry. And in France in particular, the conditions were so bad in the slave plantations that originally the laws were that you had to forcibly convert your slaves from their heathen primitive religion into the Catholic religion in order to save their souls. But they didn't really live long enough to bother doing that. So they just transported whole villages, in a sense, across from West Africa to the Caribbean. And what happened then was a kind of weird synthesis of African native beliefs. So it's thought that the word zombie might mean soul in various West African languages. A mix of that with Catholicism, with the kind of ruling elites' beliefs. So you get these weird synthetic religions. Voodoo is one of them, the most famous, but there's also Santeria in Cuba, and there's Obeah in Jamaica, and it's from voodoo that you get the idea of the zombie.
So zombies and slavery are connected through voodoo, but wherever the zombie crops up, slavery is there too. Look at the famous zombie cocktail. It's made of a blend of fruit juices and rum.
The zombie is made out of rum because that's the slaves' drink. The slaves were the ones who invented rum from alcohol fermented from sugarcane. It was the only thing they were allowed to drink. So there's a lot of kind of combinations there that goes straight back to slave history.
Stage 2. Pulp fiction. By the 1930s, the zombie had established itself in mainstream popular culture in the US, and the monster became a mainstay of the pulp magazines of this time. This was the golden age of pulp fiction. The pulps were fiction magazines published on cheap pulp paper, and they sold in their millions. They were incredibly popular. The genres that we know today, like science fiction, horror, detective stories, and so on, they all kind of came out of the pulps in one way or another around this time as well.
The zombie is particularly associated with American pulp stories. There is a very famous pulp magazine called Weird Tales, which started in 1923, which is famously associated with H.P. Lovecraft, but that repeatedly looked for the exotic margins of American imperial culture, so in the Caribbean, and the zombie was the perfect kind of model for this. And they published lots of people who are now largely forgotten, who wrote stories about zombies. So the two most famous would be Theodore Roscoe, who sold tens of millions of stories in the 1920s and 1930s, completely forgotten now, but wrote a book called Z is for Zombie, for example. And the other truly amazing writer from that period was Henry Sinclair Whitehead, who Lovecraft, very famous now, of course, but Lovecraft said he was the most interesting man he'd ever met. And he wrote these horrific stories about slave beliefs and superstitions and ghost stories and hauntings and vengeful narratives, whilst being an Episcopal bishop down in one of the Caribbean islands that belonged to the American state.
So even bishops were writing about zombies at this point. This was also the time of early cinema, and directors looking for source material kept a very close eye on the pulp magazines. Stage 3. The zombie film. Early zombie films like White Zombie mentioned earlier tended to treat the zombie as an individual who can be controlled by a sorcerer. They use some sort of poison or spell to reanimate and control the zombie. But this isn't really how we tend to imagine zombies today. In modern popular culture, there are zombie hordes. It's a zombie apocalypse, a global contagion with masses of marauding creatures consuming human flesh and infecting everyone they encounter. Like the Army of the Dead in Game of Thrones, or the zombie masses in films like World War Z or 28 Days Later. So, somewhere between the 1930s and now, something drastic changed.
There are two really influential sources for that. One would be the recognition of the living dead as they were found in concentration camps, and this was a major kind of trauma across the West, which still continues, the sense of this just vast numbers being processed, and the survivors in this state, where many of them were so far gone into a kind of state of living death that they couldn't be rescued, they couldn't be brought back to health. So that has haunted our imagination ever since. But particularly for American culture, the Second World War, of course, was a brief respite, and they went straight back into battle. In the Cold War, they ended up fighting on the Korean Peninsula, and the American army was completely overwhelmed by the strategy of the communist peasant army, which was to just simply hurl thousands and thousands and thousands of unarmed peasants across the border to overrun American emplacements. And this was a strategy that was hugely expensive in terms of life. Tens of thousands of people were killed. But the Chinese communist thought was that the Americans would be so appalled by their own slaughter that they would, in a sense, give up. And it kind of worked for 6 months, actually, at the beginning of the Korean War. So that sense of, we always think of zombies as being these hordes that overrun small American houses or emplacements or shopping malls, whatever. That sense of being overrun by a mass, a horde that you can't differentiate, is, I think, straight from the Korean War.
And in the aftermath of all this comes George Romero's 1968 film Night of the Living Dead, the film that changed how we see zombies forever, even if it didn't technically have any zombies in it.
Romero's zombie story is actually not a zombie story. I mean, he doesn't use the word zombie at all in that film. He refers to them as ghouls, which is a North African term, a North African superstition. And actually what he was doing was adapting a vampire story. That's Matheson's I Am Legend, which has been made repeatedly.
This is Richard Matheson's I Am Legend. It's a great book, most recently made into a not particularly great, but not terrible film with Will Smith.
So that idea of the one surviving human being who's completely menaced by a massive crowd of, in that case, vampires. That was one of the bases for his film. So it's kind of a misrecognition, really. And it's only 10 years later that his follow-up, we know as Dawn of the Dead, in fact, that was called Zombie 2 when it was released in Italy, and it was funded partly by Dario Argento in Italy. So it's only a retrospective sense that this becomes a zombie film.
Night of the Living Dead, a low-budget independent film, was a huge success and has remained a classic for a number of reasons. For one, there's
the complete accident of it being released in 1968 at a point of the most profound revolutionary turbulence in American culture. So a sense of having a black hero, again, an accident. He was simply the best actor in their group of amateurs. Having a black actor at the centre of this and portraying him overthrowing white authority was incendiary, and it was shown in black ghettos alongside films about slavery, and that sense of it having a real political edge was picked up very fast, so that by 1970 it was being shown at the Museum of Modern Art, and it was being praised as this genuinely radical, revolutionary kind of film. So you have a kind of pulp energy that comes out of Romero that also has a major kind of political critique behind it that people really latch onto, and it's what gives Romero and what gives the zombie metaphor a kind of power for filmmakers, but also for critics. It's why academics like me get obsessed with zombies, I think.
So Romero created a template for the zombie industry that would spring up in the wake of his films. But as with all the best creatures of this type, they change so readily to reflect the times in which they are portrayed. Which brings us up to today. Stage 4. The contemporary zombie. The 21st century zombie narrative is far more concerned with the globalised world, reflecting fears of pandemics or bioterrorism.
So I do think that the zombie begins to change in around the late 1990s. And you might also think that that's an obvious moment when we start to use words like globalization and the ideas of the costs of globalization as well as its benefits. So I think in the late 1990s, texts like 28 Days Later begin to produce a new kind of zombie. I mean, it caused a huge scandal 28 Days Later because it broke the rules, even though there are no rules. It broke the rules because the zombies here were running, which had immense kind of energy. They were no longer this shuffling, idiotic crowd, but were kind of feral and driven by this kind of viral rage. And that has been hugely influential, thinking about ideas of contagion. So all of the Resident Evil franchise, which is a vast franchise, even more successful as a video game than as 7 or 8 films. That is all driven by the idea of contagion.
Or more recently again, there's the thinking zombie.
So I think the change that has happened in the 2010s is a real interest now in not seeing the zombie as this idiotic mass or horde, although that's still around, but a sense in which what becomes interesting is that the zombies might have a form of consciousness. So what would it be like to be on the side of the zombie, not on the side of the survivor? So what is zombie consciousness? Can you have zombie consciousness? Lots of philosophers have become very interested in that, and lots of filmmakers have too, trying to explore the idea of the sympathetic zombie, I suppose. Series like iZombie, as its name suggests, the idea of exploring the subjectivity of what it means to be a zombie, and that is kind of done in a tone of comic survival, and then you also get things like Warm Bodies as well, which is also about someone who is turned into a zombie and then returns back into the human. And you've had a whole series of investigations about these hybrid forms between human and zombie, like The Girl with All the Gifts, which is a very good book and a very bad film.
So is there still a link today between the modern zombie and the dead men working in cane fields or the tales encounters by writers well over a century ago?
There is a sort of sense of an echo of a kind of colonial. It's always a colonial metaphor. My sense of it is that the zombie is something that does, whether it knows it or not, speak to us about inequalities of power and the rights of colonial powers to exercise life and death decisions on others. So some people have talked about contemporary globalization as it's run by multinational corporations as a form of necropolitics, a kind of decision about who is worth living, who is not worth living, and therefore letting die. So even down to a kind of anxiety about we know that the next World Cup in Qatar, all of those buildings that the game is going to be played in are being built by zombie workers, in effect, by guest workers who work in terrible conditions, who are dying in a really vast rate. And the politics of that is a necropolitics. It is a kind of politics of zombification.
Skip forward 50 years into the future, and it seems unlikely the zombie will have disappeared. Like all the best horror creations, the zombie is adaptable and malleable. It reflects our fears and anxieties. The zombie is always us. But while the zombie may take on other forms, may represent new fears, that link back to slavery and power and control is there, underneath the surface. Perhaps the zombie will exist for as long as these issues of inequality and imbalances of power remain in the world. That may be a while. That's it for episode 12 of Words to That Effect. Thank you so much for listening. I am very excited to announce that this is the first Words to That Effect episode as part of the Headstuff podcast network. The show is now part of headstuff.org, a fantastic hub of creative content on culture, history, film, music, and lots more. And the Headstuff podcast network is made up of 20 great Irish podcasts, so go check them out and find your new second favourite podcast. Special thanks this week to Professor Roger Luckhurst. There is lots more about zombies in his really fantastic book, Zombies: A Cultural History. I'll put links to the book, to Professor Luckhurst's bio, and to his other upcoming publications, such as the Cambridge Companion to Dracula, on the Words to That Effect website, which is wttepodcast.com. Music this week was by two fantastic Irish groups, Overhead the Albatross and the Jimmy Cake. Links to their work are at WTTE Podcast as well. You can also follow the show on Facebook, and I'm on Twitter at CEDReid, CEDReid. Finally, just to let you know, this is the penultimate episode of Season 1 of Words to That Effect. There will be one more episode, a Christmas special, in collaboration with the podcast Down Below the Reservoir, which I'm really excited about. It's going to take a little bit longer to make, so it'll be out in 3 weeks' time, not 2. So that's Monday, December the 18th, and then I'm taking a break for Christmas. I'll give you some more details about Season 2 at the end of the next episode, but until then, thanks for listening.